My name's Virginia Cox. I'm with the media team at Real Progressives. Our guest tonight is Fadhel Kaboub, an old friend of Real Progressives. He's an associate professor of economics at Denison University. His research focuses on the political economy of the Middle East and the fiscal and monetary policy dimensions of job creation programs. His Twitter handle is at Fadhel Kaboub, and at GISP lower thingy tweets. And you can find the Global Institute at global-isp.org. So thank you. Welcome, Fadhel. We always love having you.
Thank you, Virginia. Thank you for having me on the program. It's a pleasure to join Real Progressives one more time in 2020. This year that we're hoping will end on a positive note somehow. I was asked to comment today on a few things. One of which is the year 2020 and the economy in the U.S., the global economy, especially in the global South, in the midst of this pandemic. So what I will say, I'll try to keep my comments to less than 30 minutes, hopefully, and then open it up for Q&A. I'd rather have a back and forth conversation than spend the whole hour doing graphs and charts. So this is what I have planned for tonight. So where are we now, and where do we go from here in terms of the political economy of this pandemic? There are vaccines that are being rolled out right now, so it looks like it's going to take a few months to get to the level where we can, get to a point where there's somewhere close to herd immunity, and that requires 80+% of the population getting the vaccine, which is going to take a long time. And we're already seeing some issues related to inequality between the global North and the global South in terms of who's going to get the vaccines and who's going to be able to, distribute the vaccines. So the economy has been, shut down in the beginning of the pandemic in the case of the U.S. And then as we started to reopen in the middle of the summer, it was very clear from the beginning that we're not going to go back to pre-COVID economic activity. There's a recession built into the pandemic crisis. So where are we today? We have a new administration coming on January 21st, the Biden administration. From what I can tell from the nominations, from the tone of the administration, it doesn't look like we're going to have something close to what we would call a Green New Deal, meaning a comprehensive policy platform that pushes for radical transformation on the climate front and on the economic inequality and social justice front. That being said, it's definitely going to be a more progressive administration than what we've seen in the last 4 years in the U.S. But the depth of the climate crisis, the socioeconomic exclusion crisis, is not something that would require small incremental intervention. So my expectation from the Biden administration, regardless of what happens in Georgia, who wins the Senate and who dominates the Senate, the Biden administration is going to be pushing for infrastructure spending, is going to be pushing for some level of economic relief. But given the people we've seen on the administration's nominations list, it's going to be people who are okay and comfortable with a relatively large fiscal push, but they're going to be the type that will slow down the fiscal stimulus way too soon, way before the economy has fully dealt with what I would call economic relief, and then moved into true reform and moving closer to full employment and economic prosperity. On the climate front, we'll probably see a lot of positive things in terms of regulations going back to, say, the Obama years level of regulations, environmental regulations and protection. But it's not going to be an administration that will fully transition us away from fossil fuels, especially fracking and natural gas. So the urgency of the situation is that we have less than 10 years to undo decades worth of fossil fuels and CO2 emissions, and we have to do it rapidly within a very short time frame. So the urgency of the situation and the level of intervention expected from the Biden administration simply don't match. And this is if we're looking at the world in a very narrow US-centric perspective, which would be a mistake because climate change is a global issue. Economic inequality, socioeconomic dislocation is a global issue. So we have to have a global response. It will be helpful to have the US back on the table, so to speak, of negotiations on the climate front, in the climate negotiations, the Paris Climate Accords, and so on. But it's not sufficient to sit around the table and talk about 2050. You have to put your money and your action where your mouth is when it comes to climate change. And you have to do it quickly on a massive scale, not only within the physical borders of the United States, but we have to do it across the world, not just in Europe and Japan and Australia, but we have to have also the global South involved in decarbonizing the economy and resetting the global financial system that's been established in 1945 under the Bretton Woods agreements at a time where there were no developing countries, there were simply colonies. So they were not invited to the table to establish the global financial system. They were colonies. And then by the time that post-war global financial system was transitioning into a post-Bretton Woods system, most of those developing countries became independent and became developing nations in need of massive reconstruction and economic development funds. And that's where we went straight into the oil crisis in the 1970s, straight into the debt crisis in the 1980s, which was called the lost decade from an economic development perspective. And then comes the 1990s with the Washington Consensus, with essentially a neoliberal a reset in the global South that took the state out of the equation and brought free market economics as a dominant approach, meaning massive reduction in government involvement in public investment in education and public health, and privatized a lot of government resources, and led to this neoliberal era that we've lived under since the 1990s at least. So where do we stand in terms of the situation of the global South and its capacity to address climate change, to address the global economic system that's been purely extractive when it comes to developing countries? So a number that I usually like to cite in this context, because it just in one number you can see the extent of the problem, is the following. If you take the entire world and divide it into global North and global South, rich countries versus poor countries, and try to assess the net flow of financial resources, is money flowing from poor countries to rich countries or vice versa? What we find in the latest numbers we have is that the net amount of financial transactions, meaning if you take into account exports, imports, foreign direct investment, foreign aid, interest payments, all of these things, you find at the end of the day, $2 trillion moving from the global South to the global North. And that number has been increasing systematically for at least 2 or 3 decades. In the early 2000s, for example, that number was $500 or $600 billion a year. And then it became $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion. Now we're at $2 trillion. So if we don't do anything to the structure of the global financial system, the international trade system under the neoliberal era, that number is going to be larger in the next decade. So if we have this conversation in 10 years, it's probably going to be 3, 4, maybe $5 trillion. So that's the extractive nature of the financial system from the global north, from the global south to the global north. If you set that number on the table and then assess the climate situation, again, divide the world into global south and global north and see, who's responsible for most of the emissions. And you track this historically, you find that most of the CO2 emissions have been released into the atmosphere by the global north primarily. It gets tricky when you look into China and India. Are they in the global north? Are they in the global south? But that's an easy thing to sort out. Both countries had very small amounts of contributions per capita for a long time, and then they started to rapidly increase emissions in the last couple of decades. But then you trace where those emissions go in terms of the output that's being produced, who's actually consuming this stuff. It turns out it's mostly the global north. So in terms of the carbon footprint of consumer goods, even though they're produced in China and India, but most of it is consumed in the global north. So the net amount at the end of the day, it's really the global north who's responsible for what we would call a climate debt. But who's facing the most striking negative consequences of climate change? It's the global south, right? So this opens up the conversation about the case for climate reparations, for paying for that climate debt, right? Even in international negotiations about climate change, there is this concept of a carbon budget, that we in the world have a certain amount of CO2 emissions, fossil fuels that we're allowed to burn, up to a certain maximum limit. That's our global budget. And most of that budget, if you divide it up by country, based on whatever formula you want, most of that budget has been consumed in the global north, and the global north is now over-consuming its global budget for CO2 emissions. And the global south has been under-consuming CO2 emissions because it's been underdeveloping and so on. So that's the concept of climate debt. So to me, there's a case to be made for climate reparations. That is transfer of money and transfer of technology, transfer of know-how to the global south to help rapidly decarbonize, to help rapidly build clean energy infrastructure, which is a prerequisite for economic development. And that will be our only way globally to move rapidly to clean energy and to hopefully meet the climate challenge by the end of the century, which most climate scientists are telling us we can't exceed the 1.5 degree limit of global warming by the end of the century. 2 degrees is really pushing it. And at the current pace, we're on track to exceed that by a lot, to exceed that to a level that would make the planet uninhabitable. We're talking about 4 to 6 degrees in terms of warming by the end of the century, which means we're not meeting the challenge. We're talking about extinction. So that's on the climate front. So remember that $2 trillion worth of money being extracted from the global south. We want to reverse that. Part of that reversal of flow of funds and resources would be climate reparations. Now, does the Biden administration have climate reparations on the table? Not even close, right? Any other European government has climate reparations on the table? Not even close, right? So this is what we need to be pushing for, is bolder, more transformative, radical solutions. Radical in the linguistic sense of the term, which means going to the roots of the problem. The second component of reparations is what many people call colonial reparations or neocolonial reparations. So that extraction of resources, of physical resources, natural resources, extraction of resources, even in the form of brain drain from the global south to the global north, is something that can be traced back to colonial times. And every time you think about colonialism, you have to think of a very simple concept that a lot of people miss when they talk about colonialism, especially people who oppose reparations and even reject the idea that colonialism was a violent time period, that it was abusive, which unfortunately we see a lot of, not just on social media, but even government officials in Europe and other parts of the world have this myth in the back of their heads that colonialism was the white man's burden. We just went there to help develop them and civilize the nation and so on. So if you look at the actual history of colonialism, it's important to remember this concept that Africa, for example, a lot of people thought, or those who oppose colonial reparations argue that Africa was a poor country, was a poor continent, and we from Europe and the global north went there to help develop and build infrastructure and bring education and so on. That's a myth, because a rich country will not invade a poor country for no reason. Africa was invaded, was colonized precisely because it was super rich in resources and minerals and labor capacity. That's why it was attractive. India was not colonized by England because it was poor. India was colonized by England because it was extremely rich. And it was, the colonial period moved India from being a country that represented close to 25% of global GDP when the British showed up. And by the time the British left, India was less than 2% of global GDP. So India was a rich country and became a poor country because of colonialism. And you can go down the list, not just India. Every single country that was colonized was, the colonial experience was meant to do the following. You extract cheap resources with cheap labor, in some cases with violence, with coercion, and you ship the natural resources to the homeland, to England, to France, to Spain and Germany and Italy, which was the industrial base, right? You produce high value added content, manufacturing good and so on. You bring the cheap food, you bring the cheap natural resources, inputs from the colonies, and you specialize in industrial production and you pursue industrialization further and further. And the few instances of industrial development that was happening pre-colonial intervention was actually shut down during colonial times, including in textiles and so on. Anything that had the potential to actually develop as an industry was shut down. So the purpose was to use the colony for extractive purposes. And then once the industrial output is produced, the textiles are produced and so on, you use the colonies as a market for your global output now. You use that to materialize your industrial gains. So that relationship meant that you're not going to build infrastructure, you're not going to invest in education, you're not going to invest in healthcare to the level that will bring the colonial quality of life to the same level as the mainland quality of life. And that is empirically true in every single case. Yes, there were hospitals that were built here and there. Yes, there were schools that were built here and there. But the goal was never to bring those, the level of economic quality of life and prosperity in the mainland to the same level as the colonies. And the numbers speak for themselves. So there's a case to be made for colonial reparations, for the extraction of wealth, for the mismanagement of natural resources, for the destruction of natural resources, and so on. And that system didn't end with Independence Day for most developing countries. That system became the neo-colonial extractive system, because once you figure out how to extract the most out of a country, out of a developing country, then at some point you realize that you don't actually need to have physical presence and troops to continue the extraction. You can continue the extraction via an economic model, right? So you create the dependency relationship because you've extracted, plenty, and you've underdeveloped the system plenty, that now the entire economy is dependent on the mainland for buying technology, for buying resources for healthcare, for financial economic development, so the banking system, the financial system, and so on. So that creates a situation where on day one after independence, most countries, most post-colonial countries, they don't start from scratch and recreate an economic system. They continue exactly with the same model. So they continue digging the same mines, shipping those minerals on the same railroads to the ports that were built by the colonial authority, and then shipping the output to its final destination in Europe to feed the industrial development of the global north. Because that's the first thing you do day one after independence. You have to produce something, you have to create economic activity. So you're not going to shut down the economy for 6 years and say, now how do we redesign our independent economic model? So that's part one. Part two is that the political system that was left in place during the colonial times, the administrative system, was not democratic. I mean, colonialism was not democratic. It was top-down political hierarchy, administrative hierarchy for purposes of extraction. So day one after independence, most developing countries didn't scrap their entire bureaucratic system and political system and start from scratch. They pretty much continued with the same administration, which was top-down, hierarchical, in other words, dictatorial, right? Because it was colonial. And economically, it was continuing to serve the economic interest of the domestic elite and the main elite in Europe and the global north. So that's what continues the so-called neocolonial extraction that continues to some extent to this day, because now it's even more sophisticated because you have an external debt that developing countries have been accumulating since independence, and MMT shines a bright light on this particular angle, which essentially we discovered that the external debt that has been accumulated over time is different than the US national debt. The US national debt is completely sovereign, it's completely manageable under in the US because it's all denominated in US dollars, the national currency of the United States. Whereas the debt of most developing countries is primarily denominated in foreign currencies that you have to earn either via exports or via tourism or foreign direct investment, which means your entire economic system is now obsessed with earning US dollars and euros and British pounds, which means you have to attract foreign direct investment. So you set up all kinds of privileges, and that creates a situation of racing to the bottom, lowering your environmental standards, lowering your labor standards, and offering foreign investors as many advantages as you can, as possible. So that creates a scenario where the accumulation of external debt forces a country into two options. Option number one, if you don't do anything and you try to slow down the increase of your external debt, you have to accept a currency depreciation. So if your currency depreciates relative to the dollar, let's say you're a developing country like Tunisia or Egypt or South Africa, and your currency depreciates, the next morning you have to import something like basic necessities like food, medicine, energy, right? A lot of countries import fossil fuels. Everything you import after a depreciation of your currency becomes more expensive, which means you're importing inflation, which means your people will be, rioting the next day, food riots and public transportation riots and cost of living riots. And you'll be importing inflation, and you'll be potentially starting a hyperinflation spiral in your economy, especially if it leads to a political system breakdown. So most countries don't want that. They want political stability. They want social justice and social stability. So what do? They artificially keep the value of their currency stable by bringing in more foreign debt, more borrowing in US dollars to pay for that food deficit and energy deficit and medical necessities deficit, which means it's a vicious cycle of additional external debt, which now puts you even more underwater, so to speak, and more under the control of foreign lenders. the IMF, the World Bank, other private financial institutions. So this is the monetary sovereignty and economic sovereignty approach that we've been emphasizing in the MMT community. And the only way to escape that is not by just announcing on CNN that today we have monetary sovereignty. It doesn't change anything. I always say you have to earn it. You have to work to establish monetary sovereignty and actually reclaim it. And the best way to do it is by addressing the roots of the external debt, which happen to be primarily food imports, energy imports, and low value added content of manufacturing. So now you reset your entire economic vision to focus on food sovereignty, meaning you produce as much of your domestic food necessities so you don't have to import basic necessities, food in particular. And you can do this sustainably in a sustainable agriculture type of policy. The second component is energy sovereignty, especially renewable energy sovereignty. That allows you, number one, to reduce your external debt and to liberate your economy from that external constraint. Number two, create potentially millions of jobs and decarbonize the economy. So if we link this particular component to climate reparations, this is the area where we can rapidly provide economic relief for developing countries. And then focusing your industrial policy not on exporting anything at any cost, but focusing on exporting things that actually bring higher value added content of manufacturing, which means you gradually over time specialize in more complex production system. So economic complexity of your output is important, and the value added of what you produce is important. So that provides a completely different sort of paradigm shift in terms of economic development, in terms of setting national priorities. All of this cannot take place without well-informed citizens. It's not enough to have well-informed politicians and economists, which is a whole other battle. But I think for us who are interested in this rapid transformation of the global system, we can call for a revolution day and night, and we can have all kinds of angry people taking over governments and whatever, but it wouldn't really change much. I always joke and say what we need is well-informed pitchforks. So revolutions that bring political change, but no change in policy or no change in vision, don't really produce anything. In a way, they tend to backfire after a few years because you bring all that hope for change and progress and democracy and freedom and justice, and then you get more of the same. And I've seen this in Tunisia and other parts of the world. So it's important to have a clear vision for transformative policy. And that clear vision can be introduced in the political process without necessarily a traditional social revolution with people overthrowing governments and things like that. So in the case of the US, I talk a lot about this in the US, but it applies in other countries. We have, whatever you want to call it, a democratic system, right? We have 535 people who represent us in Washington, D.C., and they're supposed to serve the interests of the people. But we all know that the vast majority of them serve the interest of the super PACs that put them in office. We have certain issues that are sort of no-brainer when it comes to where the voice of the people is and where the actions of those representatives are. Healthcare reform, for example, universal healthcare is a no-brainer. And yet we have the majority of people in Congress, both parties, who oppose it. Who else opposes it? It's the super PACs who fund them. Who else opposes it? It's the media companies that spin their stories and the lobbyists who work with them, which is a very small, tiny minority. So this is what I think about when I think about radically transforming the system, is moving towards a government of the people, by the people, for the people. So on this particular small item, healthcare reform, we have a very clear vision and a consensus across the nation about what needs to happen, which is great, but it's not sufficient until you get the 535 people to be on board to actually represent the interest of the people. So why do they oppose this? They say it's too expensive, we can't afford it, which is where the MMT lens becomes even more powerful. This is where those well-informed pitchforks become more effective, because you can call their bluff, you can unseat them, you can vote them out of office, because they have no ammunition to push back against your argument. So they say we can't afford it unless we cut spending here, unless we cut spending there, right? Which at the end of this day, they say, well, you know what, we can't cut military spending, we can't cut spending here and there, we can't tax more than that. So this healthcare reform is just not going to happen on this dramatic scale. It's going to have to happen on a smaller, incremental, Obama-like style, which is precisely what Joe Biden, for example, is proposing. But if we call their bluff and say, well, wait a minute, we know we can afford this, because MMT tells us the following. MMT says the mainstream of economics and politics tell us that the fiscal spending space of the government is very small. It's whatever we can tax, whatever we can borrow from the market. And MMT says, wait a minute, the fiscal spending space of the government is much, much larger than that. It's not unlimited. It's constrained by the risk of inflation. So what determines the risk of inflation from an MMT perspective? It's two things. One is the lack of productive capacity. In other words, if we run out of talented people, machinery, equipment, hospital beds, then we can hit the barrier of inflation. The good news about that is that productive capacity is producible. We can train more people, we can build more resources, we can develop better technology. So that allows us to expand the productive capacity, which means expand that barrier, that inflation barrier limit, which means we have larger fiscal policy space. So that's the good news, is that we can employ millions of people to increase productive capacity, which is great. The second component of that risk of inflation has to do with market power, abusive pricing behavior by key players in the economy who actually suffocate the system and suffocate the potential spending for the economy. So I don't have to name names, you know who they are. It's the healthcare industry, health insurance industry, it's Wall Street, it's the oil and gas companies, it's all of these mega corporations that suffocate the economic system and hijack the economy from us, hijack it on both ends, on the economic front, because they dominate and don't allow competition and abuse the system. And then on the political system, they literally hijack the political system via their super PACs and their campaign contributions, which is where the role of lawmakers comes in. Lawmakers are supposed to regulate the market, regulate the system. But if they're captured by economic interest, they're not going to serve the interest of the people, they're going to serve the interest of the super PACs. That's where the well-informed pitchforks can, set their feet on fire essentially and say, if you're not representing me, and if you're hijacking the economy, and if you're suffocating the economy and pretending as if we don't have the financial resources, then I'm going to vote you out. And you can't argue with that. There is no calling that bluff bigger than that. And I think that's why the MMT approach is scary for them, because it takes that veil from the political system that says we're out of money, we need the rich, we need the corporations, so we can tax them a little bit and have modest social services programs and things like that. That's not going to cut it when it comes to tackling climate change. So going back to the global picture for the next decade, what MMT tells us is that not all countries have the same fiscal spending capacity as the United States. The global north in general has a larger spending capacity, a larger degree of monetary sovereignty than the global north, than the global south, that's for sure. The global north also happens to have a larger degree of industrial capacity, technological capacity to actually tackle climate change. So that's point number two. You can spend more without causing inflation. And you can also increase your spending capacity by taxing and regulating your abusive price setters in the global north. So you have large spending capacity, you have technological advantage, and you've emitted the most in CO2 emissions, you've extracted the most from the global south, and most of the global north has had a long history of colonial extraction. So you're responsible for climate debt. You're responsible for colonial debt. And you have the resources to pay for it, not just in terms of monetary transfer of resources to the global south, but in terms of transfer of technology and capabilities to rapidly decarbonize the system. So this is my vision, my dream for the world in the next 10 years. I think we can do it. I believe we can do it technologically. I believe we can do it politically. The closer we get to that ticking time bomb when it comes to climate crisis, the more feasible this will become, the more unsustainable the political system, the economic system, and the ecosystem will be. I'd rather have us do it now. We should have done this 20, 30, 40 years ago, but I'd rather have us do it now while we can still breathe, while we can still think, in a relatively focused way, and take advantage of this pandemic moment to regroup and reset, not the great reset that you read about on social media, but a different kind of global reset that includes climate reparations, colonial reparations, and rapid decarbonization. So that's my hope for the next 10 years, and is in terms of empowering the average person in the United States and other parts of the world to think in a truly transformative way. We can get sucked into our space in the US and think about the Green New Deal and think about Medicare for All, which will be a tremendous improvement. It's like the New Deal of the 1930s, but a New Deal in the US is nice, but it's not sufficient. It's not going to change the world. And if we take the New Deal of the US and export it to other countries, it's not going to undo the colonial damage. It's not going to undo the global financial system and its extractive nature. So there are so many mechanisms that we need to repair. So we have to think on a much larger, bolder scale, which, to be honest, it's very clear that it's not part of the Biden administration's agenda. And to be honest, it wasn't even on the Bernie agenda. Even Bernie's so-called climate fund would have been tiny in terms of its what is needed on a global scale, and it wasn't really meant in a reparations framework. I don't think it was, fully developed. It was symbolic in the bigger scheme of things. So for us as real progressives, we really need to think in a radical way, like Martin Luther King says. I have no time for the tranquilizing drugs of gradualism and incrementalism. He was a radical, right, in the context of social justice and the civil rights movement. In the same sense, we need to be radicals today and not settle for the tranquilizing drug of $3 trillion worth of infrastructure, or of a relatively progressive climate policy on the global scale, or even in the U.S. scale. So we have to think on a truly transformative way. So I'll stop here, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions related to this, and I'm happy to answer any questions and provide any additional clarifications.
Thank you.